And we're very honored today to have David and Chelom Leavitt with us. Some of you may know their daughter Danielle, who is a Russian major and is leaving for the Kiev, Ukraine mission at the end of April. Beginning of April. David and Chelom Leavitt are from the Leavitt Institute. They founded this institute in 2005 after they had spent a year in Ukraine. They spent a year in Ukraine at the request of the American Bar Association to help the Ukrainian government modernize and reform its Soviet criminal justice system. And they fell in love with the Ukrainian people at that point, and you've gone back many, many times since then. I mean, they've spent quite a bit of time there. The Leavitt Institute is designed, they send legal professionals all over the world, primarily to Ukraine, but a few other countries as well, to work on developing democratic institutions, civil liberties, and the rule of law. They are both graduates of UAU's law school, and we're just really grateful that they could come and be with us today. So let's give them a hand. Let me know if you need anything.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction coming up. We actually have lived in Ukraine 3 times now and love Ukraine. But it didn't start that way. We were asked by the American Bar Association to go over and help with their judicial reform in 2004 and knew nothing of Ukraine, had to look it up on a map. We were given the option of Ukraine, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. And we said, you know what, you choose. We don't know anything about these countries. What's best for a family with 6 children? And they said, well, maybe Kiev. So
we still don't know why. We just took them at their word.
That's right, yeah, and I still don't know why. Well, maybe. So we made a bunch of preparations, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But part of our philosophy for wanting to go and help with the ABA was that we really felt that people can make a difference. What we do influences others, and those little things eventually add up and make a difference in somebody's life, if not a whole country. And that lesson was taught to us very poignantly within the first few weeks after our arrival.
You want to turn the lights down a little bit?
Yeah, could we turn these lights down just to take if there are?
I think the right question is which of these turns up which lights.
There we go. That's good enough. Okay. Oh. Just reset it. There's sound.
Yeah,
We'll stop it just one more time so we can get the full effect.
sure that everything's plugged in.
I think we had sound just a second ago.
Yeah, although I think it was just coming from the computer.
There we go.
Perfect.
Just the volume here, very securely.
We'll see how it is. Okay, we'll reset it one more time.
That's a promotional video that we have put together to recruit lawyers and judges to go over to the nations where we teach, primarily in Ukraine. And our message simply is that every one of us has something that we can offer to another person, and we're going to make a change in the world. No question about that. The only question is whether we're going to make a change for the better, or whether we're going to make a change for the worse, or whether we'll change it a little, or whether we'll change it a lot. And so that's the message that we try to give not only to our students in Ukraine, but also to the judges and lawyers that go over for us.
Right, and we saw a great example of this just 2 weeks after we landed in Kiev. The Orange Revolution broke out. They had the elections the very day we got there. And it was a rigged election. Yushchenko clearly had the majority of the support, but he lost. And so after the election, the votes were counted, he went down on the main square and just rallied his people. And he said, you know, this is our opportunity. We need to have a voice. We have been silenced and never had freedom, although we've had independence since 1991. It's time for us to speak up. And at this time, he was very, very sick. He had been poisoned in September, should have died, but didn't. So when he went down and made this initial speech, he was on a lot of morphine. And it was about all he could do to make this 15-minute speech, to rally the people to then come the next day. And his family and his campaign people said, why did you say come the next day? You should have stayed on the square and rallied people. And he said, if they're not going to come the next day, then they're not going to come. They're not committed enough.
This was in like early November, and everybody showed up and they were angry. There were, you know, I think there were 50 or 100 people there that day. And he said, it's cold, it's snowing, you're not properly dressed, go home, get your warm coats, get your boots, get your gloves, and come back to the square. And that's when his family got upset with him.
Right. Well, so we didn't know anything about this. We weren't even aware of the revolution until it was a week or so into the protest. When we came, we were one family. We had 6 kids, and we didn't have the little guy who's in there, but everybody else we had with us. We had 48 pieces of luggage. This is not actually our luggage, but I thought it was luggage. And we were quite the spectacle. We were not prepared to live in Ukraine, but we were determined to do it. We brought the essentials, which for us was Stephen's hot chocolate.
Our first foray into, or our first understanding that life was not going to be the same for us came in the airport. We arrived with these 48 pieces of luggage, and they weren't suitcases like that because we didn't have that many suitcases. They were uniform U-Haul moving boxes that all looked the same size. They were weighed to the ounce on the bathroom scale here in Utah and sent over. But we had like a whole case full of Stephen's Gourmet hot chocolate because we were into that and we knew we couldn't get it there. And we unloaded we showed up. There's the 6 kids, Chelom, me. Our youngest at the time was Seth, who was 3, and he was wearing his Spider-Man costume because he just had to do Spider-Man. And so we were a bit of a spectacle as we sat there in the airport. But the last box on the carousel had been lodged in kind of a nook of that carousel, and someone had battered the box, and it was lodged, and somehow a box or a can of Stephen's French vanilla gourmet hot chocolate had burst open. And you know, I'm a former prosecutor, and when I see a white powdery substance flowing out of a box, it looks exactly like a line of cocaine. And I'm looking at this cocaine going out on the thing, what it looks like, and I see these 7 Ukrainian military police with these big green hats, and they're looking at me, and I'm looking at them, and then we both look at the box, and then we look at each other, and
we retrieved all the other boxes, so they know that one's ours.
That's right. It was only for a fleeting moment that I thought, I don't think I'm going to claim that box. There's fairly good evidence here, and I don't even think I'm in a place where I'm innocent until proven guilty. So I retrieved the box, and I don't know if I heard the word in Russian or in Ukrainian, but I learned my first.
You immediately had 6 military police
these military guys surrounded me, and I learned my first Russian or Ukrainian, I should say, and Ukrainian word that day when he looked at it and smelled at it, looked at me and said, chocolate.
So we were very relieved. Some of our other first experiences were when we finally did get down to the square, we found it to be a very pleasant environment. It was almost like a party. The embassy had sent out a warning saying, no Americans should go down to the square. It's dangerous. Don't even get anywhere close to it. So we didn't obey and went down and just to observe and to give our kids a sense of what was happening here and to figure out ourselves what was happening. And when we got down there, it was this wonderful environment. In fact, just friendly and kind. And later we found out that the Yushinkos insisted that every morning and night begin and end with a prayer, and that alcohol was forbidden on the square. Those are two pretty remarkable things to happen in Ukraine, at least the alcohol. And so it was a very calm environment. There were no drunks, and it was like a party. And so we met these two university students, and here we are from America. They were thrilled to talk to us. I was thrilled to talk to them. They were willing to share what little bit of food they had with us, and told us what was happening up on the stage. There were bands, there were all sorts of rallies and speeches, and they just explained it.
To give you some sense, I mean, the day before, when we talked about Victor Yushchenko coming and saying, tomorrow go get your coats, you know, these organizers had planned for a protest. They planned for a protest that would last, you know, a few days. And they planned for a protest that would be a very large crowd. They thought there might be 20 or 30,000 people. You know, think what happens here in the United States when you want to get a very large protest. You know, you'll make a pretty good news if you have 500 people, 1,000 people. Well, as the days went on, they had nearly 1.5 million people that came to that square. And so, you know, in speaking to the organizers of the revolution, which we have, not the Yushchenkos, but the people that were putting everything together, they just said, you know, how do you fathom? What do you do? Where do you get toilets for 1.5 million people? Where do you get food for 1.5 million people? Where do you get beds for 1.5 million people? And he said, we had this meeting like after 2 or 3 days when the doors were coming off. It was completely, you know, it was out of their control. And they said, okay, do we want to try and organize this thing centrally? Or are we going to have more of a market approach where we're just going to let this thing go and see if it regulates itself? And that's what they decided to do, because they concluded that they had no ability to control where this was going, because it wasn't just 1.5 million people in Kiev, but it was 1 million people in Kharkiv and 500,000 people in Lviv, and all over the country it was breaking down. You know, Kharkiv declared itself independent from Ukraine. Lviv and Kiev declared Yushchenko their president, and the very fabric of Ukraine seemed to be disintegrating right there.
Right. That's a picture of the square. You can see how everyone is packed in, and it got even more crowded.
Yeah, well, it would go for blocks.
Yeah.
Blocks.
We'll show you some other pictures. This is another picture of a woman called, named Natalia Dmitruk, and we'll tell you her story later. But she was central to the Orange Revolution. She played a very important part. This is Victor Yushchenko before and after the poisoning. That's another picture of the before and after. But you know, this was just news. This was all that they were reporting on, and yet we would call back to the States when we could get through, and nobody knew about it. Nobody was even aware that this was happening. And it might get a small little blurb at the end of the news, but it was very small story. And yet Ukraine was pleading with the West to step in and to have some influence so that they could ensure that they could get these new elections.
You know, every morning, you know, Chelom and I were living right in the center of Ukraine, or Kiev, excuse me. And you go down the square, and you would hear these million people chanting in unison. And it bounces off these old Soviet concrete buildings and almost reverberates back into your chest. You can literally feel it. And it was just one chant, Yushchenko, Yushchenko, and it was deafening. And our 3-year-old would run around our apartment saying, Yushchenko. And one.
Funny,
no, go ahead.
Funny story. Someone said, came up to him and said, Yushchenko, and he said, I'm not a Shenko, you a Shenko.
But I think that it was on that square because I mean, it didn't matter where you went in Ukraine during these couple of months. Everybody had this orange on. When we first got there, we had no idea what the orange stickers we'd see were. You know, it wasn't until it blew up that we could tell that was the color of their campaign. But you'd be walking in the metro station, and these teenagers would like almost spontaneously erupt in chants for Yushchenko and for freedom in this empty subway station. And just like 4 men, 4 young, 4 teenagers, they'd start yelling. And it was almost as if 70 years of pent-up occupation had somehow released, and they were willing to do whatever they had to gain their freedom. And I think that's where Chelom and I started to realize that maybe we had taken a lot for granted in our own lives and in our own country. And it was really quite a sobering event for us.
It was exhilarating to be there because you really did feel this energy. Because after the election, there was just this depression. For a couple of days, people said, well, we knew it would happen. What can we expect? But then Yushchenko did this unusual thing where he actually protested and called the people together, and it really enlivened everybody, and they thought, yeah, this is our chance. You had old women saying, I have waited for this for 50 years. I am not going to let this chance go by to have a voice for freedom. You had young people saying, I saw my parents live through this for my whole life. I'm going to have a voice for freedom. You had middle-aged people who were really probably the least secure about it because their jobs were on the line. If they were caught with the opposition party, they could be fired, or the SBU, which is the KGB in Ukraine, could put some sort of restrictions on them. So there was a lot of emotion going on, and people were really deciding what they could do, how brave they could be in speaking out for freedom. So it was this really exhilarating time.
It became a time of, I want to say, spontaneous sacrifice. Because you ask the question, how do you feed 1.5 million people? How do you house 1.5 million people? And these are people who had they had left their cities, their villages, and come into the capital. And what happened was, I'm going to tell you right after the video. So
All right. Okay. Thanks. Just a few more pictures, just to show you the parades and the protests, and there was a military surrounding the entire square. And it wasn't an idle threat that the military could crack down at any moment. They were just simply waiting for the government to give the go-ahead, and they would start firing on citizens.
Incidentally, 90% of the photos you're seeing are the ones that we took ourselves. I mean, these are not taken off of the news clips from the internet. These were ones that these came from our camp.
And yet it was really this party atmosphere. I think this is one of my favorite pictures, and there's a number of pictures like that. Mostly women putting flowers into these protective shields of the military. Just showing that we're peaceful and we're not looking for anything but to have our voice for freedom.
We did not take that picture, by the way, just in the spirit of full disclosure.
Okay. And this is the picture we were most proud of while we were there. We saw this, close to the ground advertisement for Yushchenko, and we were so inspired by him that we all stood around the picture and had some passerby take our photo. And we thought, you know, this is our memento of being here, of participating in the Orange Revolution. So we were really thrilled about that. And yet our exposure would be even greater than that, as we would later find out.
And that indeed is Danielle at 12 years old.
That's true. Okay. And then this is the tent city. You know, David's talking about where does everybody sleep? Where does everybody eat? Well, they just made these makeshift houses along this one avenue of the city. The police blocked it off, and you know, these were made out of cardboard and styrofoam and all sorts of things. And then they would have these teeny little burners that they would warm themselves by, little tin cans that they'd build fires in and cook over. And you know, and that's where they slept and ate, at least a lot of them. And it was called Tent City. And you'd go down there, and it was just, again, this very warm, inviting, friendly, perfectly safe environment. Okay, and this is a video that we produced for the Leavitt Institute about our experience.
We had only been there 2 weeks when the Orange Revolution came about. We just went down, we were curious, we didn't know what was happening.
This was not one demographic group of society.
It was old and young.
There was every walk of life, every age group. It was just amazing. It's difficult to describe what it looks like to see 1.5 million people in one location with one purpose, united.
United in facing their government. Let's make no mistake, surrounding the entire square was the military.
And then you get their chants reverberating off these old Soviet buildings, 1.5 million strong. I think that it was that moment when the Leavitt Institute was born.
Seeing people willing to sacrifice to improve their country inspired us. We began to see this feeling of young people, university students, who were discontent. They weren't really free. They still aren't really free, but they're working towards it. And that's kind of what our program works towards, is what is going to work in your legal system? How can you make your country better?
Every semester we see individual hearts and minds change. That's where we see progress. That's where we see change.
And they need to be able to see that this matters and that they can contribute in a significant way. And I think that that's the message of the Leavitt Institute. We all have something to offer. I think that's the bottom line.
You know, Natalia's story.
Natalia Dimitrick, the woman I showed you the picture of at the beginning, was a sign language interpreter for the news. And so every evening she would get on the news, and down in the corner she would be interpreting what the broadcasters were saying. And of course, all of the TV stations were scripted. They had to say, there's no revolution. The government is perfectly calm. Yanukovych is our president. There's no protesting going on. And she would interpret this every night. After a couple of nights, she realized that she just felt dirty. She said that she went home and felt like she just had to shower because she was telling these lies. And so finally, she worked up the courage that she was going to tell the truth through signing. So she went to the studio where they were doing the news, and she knew what the consequence would be. She talked to all of her colleagues at the newsroom, and she said, I might not see you after the broadcast. I think she expected to be whisked away by the police or something. She said, I might not see you, but, you know, and then she expressed her feelings towards them. So the broadcast started, and she straightened out her arms, and under her sleeve was an orange ribbon. And it fell out, so while she was signing, they knew that she was supportive of Yushchenko. And she started signing and saying, I have been telling you lies. There is a protest. Yushchenko is our president. Come to the square and protest with us. And that one act helped motivate this second wave of protesters. and gained the attention of the West because it had been going on so long that there was enough pressure put on that they finally did have second elections. She was a key part.
Yeah, and it does illustrate the fact that, you know, one person makes a big difference in the right place, doing the right thing at the right time. And she didn't wake up today saying, I'm going to save my country. But that's just what happened. In speaking with, you know, Chelom and I have had this singular experience, not only in participating in the Orange Revolution, but afterwards being able to have contact with the people who made it happen. And one of the men who was one of the key organizers told me that the situation was so dire and so tense that there was infighting in the government. Some of the government people wanted to go in and do a military crackdown and get rid of them. There were those in the military that were against that. There were some on the part of the revolutionary side. Yulia Tymoshenko, according to Viktor Yushchenko, was adamant about using force and blood as a means of sealing the revolution and bringing people closer to the square. And Yushchenko's people saying, Yushchenko himself saying, you know, this revolution is over and I am conceding if there's a drop of blood spilled. And so on both sides, there were those that wanted to fight and there were those that didn't want to fight. And this organizer, they got wind that the military was in fact coming in. He went back to his office and he got a bulletproof vest that he put under his sweater, his coat, and went down to the square. And got to the square, and one of the protesters who knew who he was saw that he was wearing a bulletproof vest and started to panic. And the word started, you know, the military was coming, and this man, he said, I realized I have to be all in or I have to be all out. Because when people see me in this bulletproof vest, they know that I know something. And he said, I went back to my office, I took off my bulletproof vest, and went back to the school. And you know, these are those split-second decisions that these people make. You know, normal Ukrainians. Our friend Irina Zaretska had a 400 square foot apartment, about 40 square meters, and she had over 30 people spending the night in her apartment, just on the floor, complete, utter strangers. And that happened throughout the city. And
an interesting side note to the first story you told is that the military some of them had been plain clothes, and so they'd been mingling in with the protesters and listening to their stories, hearing what they were saying. But even the military that was in uniform and standing around heard all of the speeches, heard the reasons for the protest, and so by the time the government had delayed their order to fire on the citizens so long that the military, by that point, when they did get the order, had sided with the protesters and refused to fire on them.
midway through the protest, when this thing was all unraveling, and they were calling for a second election, and European heads of state could see that this was going in a bad direction. Everybody could see this was going for a bad direction. In a bad direction, they held very private emergency talks in a place called Mariinsky Palace in the center of Kiev at like 3 o'clock in the morning. Viktor Yushchenko told us that there were like 13 heads of state. There were the Ukrainian leadership, Kuchma and his people, there were Yanukovych's people, and then there were Yushchenko's people. And they divvied up. They were negotiating a solution to this, where they came up with a rationale where under the Ukrainian law, they could have a second, would concede to a second election, but only on the basis that Yushchenko would agree that he would take less power than Kuchma had, the previous president. Viktor Yushchenko said, this is not about my power, This is about our freedom. That was a very well-meaning statement, but it was that moment that signaled the doom of the Orange Revolution, because it split, or I should say the long-term effect. It split the powers of his presidency, where his rivals got to choose 3/4 of his cabinet, and Victor only got to choose about 1/4 of his cabinet. And at that point, the natural disintegration that comes from disunity occurred, and the Orange Revolution began, 5 years of absolute bitter infighting, which resulted in Victor Yushchenko getting, in the next election, just above 2% of the vote, because people were so angry with the fact that the United States of America hadn't occurred in 5 years.
A lot of people would say that the Orange Revolution was a failure, and economically and maybe even politically it was. But what it did, what was a huge success, was that it inspired, especially the young people, to understand that they had a voice, that they needed to speak up, and that they could make a difference. We see this over and over in our university classes when we're talking with the young people, is they're still kind of tentative, but then when they understand that their opinion is welcome, they speak up. And I don't think that was happening prior to the Orange Revolution. You saw this new idea of giving input into your government that wasn't present before.
Well, the other thing that I think has gone largely unnoticed is the fact that you have a president of a former Soviet republic who was very unpopular, who stood for re-election, and allowed himself to be utterly trounced and to leave. That certainly didn't happen with his predecessors. It hasn't happened in Russia this last time. You have an example of a man who said, this is not about me, this is about the larger picture, and this is what you voted, so be it.
Yeah, so the end of the story for us, kind of, was that in 2010, we actually met Victor Yushchenko, had lunch with him, had a great rapport. We had a lot in common. He loved what our program was doing, and we developed this friendship. Then
well, let me back up and say, Chelom and I had a relationship with his wife Katya for 5 years, and it was a close relationship, but we'd never met him. And when the Kiev temple was being built, Chelom invited Katya to go through the open house of the Kiev temple with her children, which she did. And when we were having this luncheon with her, by the way, I think that one of the other real purposes behind the Orange Revolution is the construction of the Kiev temple. It was announced long before, 7 or 8 years before, and it was during that 5-year window that the land was acquired, the temple built. That I think that was the world will recognize that, but I certainly do. We're sitting at this luncheon, and Chelom and I are explaining she says, why do you think your prophet built a temple in Kiev? We said, well, I don't know, but here's one reason that we believe in these 12 tribes of Israel, and the Kiev state has every tribe of Israel in it. And literally 12 out of 12 tribes are in the Kiev state. And it very well could be that may be part of it because it's so key to our doctrine. We talked a lot about the 12 tribes of Israel. So we get to this lunch at Victor's house, and we thought that he's going to come in, he's going to give us a handshake.
Oh, well, we were told. It was scheduled. I mean, he still had lots of security around him. We had 40 minutes. So we were going to have this brief lunch, visit a little.
We didn't think we'd get 10 minutes, so yeah. I mean, it'd be in and out. Wait. Well, we sit down there, and we're at their home, and just on the outskirts of Kiev. And Katya sits down, and Victor sits down, and the translator sits down. Katya speaks English, but there was a translator there for Victor who didn't. And the first words out of Katya's mouth were, "Why don't you two tell my husband what you told me and what you guys believe about Ukrainians and the tribes of Israel. And Chelom and I are looking at each other and thinking, I can't believe this is happening.
We didn't think that was going to be the subject.
We're going to have a gospel topic with Victor Eustace. So we give a very brief answer and move on. Victor locks in on religion. And we're there talking with him about religion
3 hours.
for 3 hours. Security guards are going crazy. Victor's waving them off. And finally, he starts to relent to his security that he's going to go, and we say, well, incidentally, he doesn't like to come to the United States. He doesn't like big cities. He's a very private guy. Give him a beehive, a grass field to grow herb tea, and he's happy. And we said, you really got to come to Utah. It's a lot different place than New York and Washington and Chicago, these places. He said, you come here, this is what we'll do. We list a bunch of things, and he gets quiet, and he says, I think I'd like to come. And his wife about fell over backwards. His wife's from Chicago originally, and he hadn't been able to persuade him since the election to come. And we left thinking, well, that's one of those let's go to dinner sometime things, And about 3 weeks later, his office calls and said, he really wants to come. Go ahead, tell me.
So they come. They came in
2011.
2011, the summer, and we vacationed with them, with their family and our family, and went to all the national, not all, but some of the national parks. Visited the Shakespearean Festival and the MTC, and he spoke at our Institute's dinner. And it was an incredible visit just to get to know the whole family. This is the luncheon where we talked about religion. And one of the things I asked him while we were traveling around Utah for hours and days.
And let me say, it's kind of a comical thing to see because Victor loved to drive.
Yeah.
And everywhere we went, we had this rented Suburban. We had the children in one Suburban, and Victor and Katya and Chelom and I in another Suburban. And Victor was driving everywhere we went.
And the security in the Suburban with the kids. So I asked him, I say, well, Victor, he had told us earlier that the person who had been responsible for bringing him to the dinner where the SVU poisoned him was his best friend. And I said, Victor, how do you forgive somebody, your best friend, who brings you to be killed? And he says, well, let me tell you a story. And he said, in the Second World War, there was a Western village, a Western Ukrainian village. And the Nazis had come in to the village and were taking control. And there was a villager who was conspiring with the Nazis. And he called all the villagers to the church and said, we're having a meeting. Everybody has to be there. So all the villagers come to the church. And just then the Nazis chained the doors and burned the church down, killing most of the villagers. And then this conspirator moves to South America, lives his life until he's very old, he's getting ready to die, and he writes a letter to this village in Western Ukraine asking their forgiveness. He says, this is what I did, I'm very sorry, I'm asking the village to forgive me. So I think it's a priest, I think they have priests there.
The guy in charge.
The guy in charge says to the congregation, he says, can we forgive him? He reads the letter and he says, can we forgive this man? Everybody says, no. That he devastated our lives. So many of our family were killed. We will not forgive him. So the leader says, okay, everybody go home. Let's think about it. Maybe you'll reconsider and we'll talk about it next Sunday. They go home, meet the next Sunday. He says, have you had a change of heart? Can we forgive this man? Everybody says, absolutely not. There's no way we will forgive him. And so the priest says, all right, I will write a letter back and tell him that we do not give our forgiveness. But when you go home tonight and you kneel down to say the Lord's Prayer, I want you to say, please do not forgive us, because we will not forgive those who trespass against us. And suddenly everybody changed their mind and realized that they needed to forgive. Because they wanted forgiveness, they would forgive. So Victor turned to me and said, so was I right to forgive my best friend? And I realized that, although I had been taught forgiveness my whole life, and believed in it, and felt like I could forgive, this was something that I thought, I don't know that I could forgive. But this man had. Victor had. I think Katya maybe struggled with it a little more than he did. But he taught us things during those travels around from state park to state park that were deeply spiritual and very inspiring to me. And I really love and admire the man. He was a great example for his country. He inspired them at a time that was critical. He changed the attitude of an entire generation. And I think that his story is not over. I think he has far more to add.
One thing that he said to us, he said, we're driving, I think this was somewhere between Milford and Cedar City. And he said, I'm having a hard time putting the words about giving man, has, maybe you can verbalize it, I can't think what the thing.
He says that most people just want to sleep as much as they
That's
can.
right, that's right.
Do as little as they can, and eat as much as they can.
Well, I said most people, they will eat as much as they can, sleep as much as they can, be as selfish as they can for themselves. He said, but if we'll just look beyond ourselves just a little bit and take on a little humanity, we can see that we can give a little of our bread for someone else. And we can give a little of our labors for somebody else. And he said, when I was the head of the central bank, at the time I took over the head of the central bank, inflation in Ukraine was at 10,410%. And we traded with coupons. We had no currency. By the time I left, inflation was at 10% and we had introduced the agreement. So when I became the prime minister, we repaid 4 years worth of pensioners' pensions. We rebuilt churches all over Ukraine. When I became the president, and the economic policies went this way, and the banking policies went that way, and I was focused on trying to help Ukrainians understand who they are. And people get mad at me, why are you focusing on this? He said, well, listen, if I want to get reelected, certainly I will focus on the banking policy. I can certainly do that. But if I want to build a nation, I'll focus on the things that will build a nation. I may not get reelected, but that's what this country needs. And he said, no, it doesn't matter what a nation's economic policy is. It doesn't matter what a nation's banking policy is. It doesn't matter what a nation's education policy is until or unless a nation understands who they are spiritually first. Once they understand who they are spiritually first, then everything else will fall into place. And it was just like, it was incredible.
This is Victor in Loa, Utah. Many of you know where that is. He decided, spur of the moment, David's mom had made a beautiful meal for us, but he decided he was going to make soup for us all. And so he went out into the garden, not only got the vegetables, but whittled the
wooden spoon.
And made soup for everybody.
Over a fire. We went and bought a wash tub.
Yeah.
He got a 2x4, made a wooden spoon, took a fish we caught, and every possible vegetables and cooked it for I don't know how long.
What's fish soup?
Okay.
Yeah, that's what he made. This is at a beehive factory. Actually, it's where they process the honey. And he was in seventh heaven.
He's a big bee guy.
Thought that was wonderful. He actually has award-winning honey that he produces himself.
Was the soup good?
It was
It
great.
was great.
It was great, yeah.
I still have the wooden spoon.
This is at one of the national parks down by Zion. And then we went to the MTC. Do you want to tell that story? Or did you tell it
Yeah.
already?
No, I didn't. So, you know, Victor and Katya got world-class treatment from the church. You know, they met with apostles, they met with auxiliary presidents, they met with, you know, the who's who of the church. But this was the most moving experience for them. They come into this MTC, this room in the MTC.
I'll tell this first.
Okay.
One of their treasured gifts was, and all the young women will understand this, but the bee that you get for after your Young Women's Medallion, and Victor loved it because it was a bee, so they appreciated that.
Yeah. So they come in here and you see these missionaries. I guess the folks with the white badges are the staff, and then the missionaries right there in the middle between Chelom and I and Victor and Katya. And there's this spirit in this room that is very moving. And Victor and Katya are speaking to these missionaries, and they both start crying. And he composes himself, and he says to him, he says, I just want to thank you for coming to my country, because I know that you're doing God's work there. And you know, they laughed, and it was a very moving experience. About 3 months after that, we were at a function with Victor and Katya in Kiev. We go to Ukraine about 10 times a year for our work. And I was there last week and took them Lucky Charms and vanilla extract.
And they send back stuff that we love from
That's
Ukraine.
right. I mean, it's just, you know. Danielle spent the summer living in their home this last summer. He stands up and starts talking to the people there about his trip to Utah. And he spends it was a Michael McLean concert.
Yeah,
Michael
we had
McLean.
this honored guest there, and everybody was thrilled to have Michael McLean there. And but Victor stands up and completely changes the subject back to the MTC.
Yeah, and he talks about Utah for like 20 seconds. He starts talking about the MTC, and he starts crying at me. He said, there's these pure people that are willing to give 2 years of their lives to go someplace that they've never seen, and I can't believe their parents who let them go. He just goes on and on and on. And then about 4 months after that, we were at their house and talking to some of their friends, and this lady says, you know, I don't know what happened to Victor, but every time we get on the topic of Utah, all he can do is talk about your language college and the people that were there. And
he tells the young missionaries that he wants to take care of them while they're in Ukraine. Well, how odd would that be for a missionary to be taken care of by the former president?
So like last week when I was there, I was sitting there talking to Katya, and the missionaries came up again. And I said, you know what would be really interesting, Katya? He said, what's that? I said, these missionaries here have been there about 18 months now. Wouldn't it be interesting for Victor to hear these guys and see how they're Ukrainians do? So Victor would love it. You need to have them come over. And you know, it's just, they just had
It was a great experience.
very, very fond feelings about the church.
We also went to the visitors center and
Hiking.
And oh, there's his soup. And more of the family at Bryce Canyon, where everybody made a big deal out of him and gave him gifts when they were there. But probably the most, the MTC and then the Family History Center were his favorite, were Katya and Victor's favorite. And I forget this sweet sister's name, but she had done research on both of their families and had actually found a relative of Victor's, because he's a big genealogy buff, but he had not found him in a village that he was unaware of, that he should look there. And so he was thrilled. He loved this woman, and I think they may still keep in some contact. But when he was here, he also did a short video for us talking about what we do in their country. And so we'll play that for you.
Україна має глибоку духовну традицію. високу мораль сім'ї. Але найбільш сьогодні ми відчуваємо потребу в реформуванні правовому. Сильне право. Це те, що потрібно сьогодні Україні. Тому я високо ціную ті ініціативи, ту роботу, яку проводить Інститут Leavitt. Це дуже потрібна і дуже актуальна робота сьогодні для України. Як з точки зору підвищення знань, кваліфікацій самих правників, самих юристів, так і для суспільного сприйняття місії і ролі права. Власне, все починається від тебе. Хочеш змінити